here's what Cyprian did believe. He says this about the bishops. And this unity we ought firmly to hold and assert, especially those of us that are bishops who preside in the church, that we may also prove the episcopate, the office of bishop, itself to be one and undivided. The episcopate is one, each part of which is held by each one for the whole. So you see that he considers all the bishops to be one, and he believed that the keys of the kingdom were handed down not to the Bishop of Rome, but to all the bishops. And so when he gets quoted as saying that the keys of the kingdom were passed on to the bishop, he means all the bishops. He doesn't mean the bishop at the Church of Rome, and that's clear because he specifically said, I don't have to listen to Peter, and it is not okay. I don't have to listen to Stephen, and it is not okay that Stephen sets himself up as a bishop of bishops. We don't have to wonder about what it was like in the early church. And so I want to conclude by just basically covering that back over again. The reasons that we know that there is not a pope in the early church is because, one, there was no individual bishop of Rome at the time that Peter died. For at least 50 years afterwards, Peter died in the mid-60s. He was martyred there in Rome. For at least 50 years afterwards, there was no bishop because it was AD 110 when Ignatius wrote to the church at Rome and didn't mention a bishop. Two, we see that the churches in the 2nd century did not feel compelled to obey the Bishop of Rome. And as a matter of fact, when the Bishop of Rome took a stand and wanted to excommunicate other churches, he was corrected by Polycarp and Irenaeus. And finally, when there was a Bishop of Rome, as late as AD 250, he was rebuked by 87 bishops who went, you can't do this. I really need to add one other thing, which is 75 years later after that council in AD 325, when the Council of Nicaea happened, what we do know is that at that time there was beginning to be a situation where a bishop was not just the leader of one city. The Council of Nicaea did not just come up with a creed, the Nicene Creed that you've probably heard of. They also issued some edicts. They were called canons. And one of the edicts that they issued, Canon 6, mentions that the bishop of the church in Alexandria was leading not just the city of Alexandria, but a couple of places that they mentioned, plus pretty much all of Egypt. They also mentioned the bishop of Antioch, I believe, and I'm speaking from memory here, it might not be the bishop of Antioch, but I think it was, who also led some areas around him. And then they mentioned the bishop of Rome, and they said he had a similar custom. What is that similar custom? That he was the leader over a part of Italy, all of Italy. We don't really know, but we do know that he didn't lead the whole Roman Empire, because it was the Bishop of Alexandria who was leading Egypt and the Bishop of Antioch who was leading his area. And they say, we want to continue that practice. We want to actually give them authority to lead a larger area. Now, those bishops, along with the bishop in Jerusalem, became known as patriarchs. And over time, they added on another one. There's also today a bishop in Russia that got added on who's known as a patriarch. And what happened is that over the centuries following, the Roman Empire got divided into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, and there was a lack of communication between the patriarchs in the East, the Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Antioch, and the Bishop in the West, who was the Bishop of Rome. And so for centuries, the Bishop of Rome pretty much led all the West by himself without really the ability to confer with those other patriarchs. When they started having communication again as the Roman Empire came back together in the 9th century, there was conflict over something that had happened with the main creed of the church, and they argued about it really for 2 centuries. In AD 1054, there was a division between those patriarchs in the East and the patriarch in the West, which was the Bishop of Rome, who's now called the Pope. And that division is known as the Great Schism, and it divided those patriarchs in the East from the patriarch in the West, the Bishop of Rome. And it just happened to work out that all the other patriarchs were in the East, and you can probably figure out that when they made a Russian patriarch, he was even further in the East than these others. So he was also Eastern. And today, those other patriarchs lead a group of churches known as Orthodox churches. There's Russian Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox churches from the Bishop of Antioch, Coptic Orthodox churches from the Bishop in Alexandria, and the bishop in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was basically destroyed. I don't believe that there's an Orthodox church from that bishop. But you have separate Orthodox churches today, just like you have a Roman Catholic church. And because he was by himself, he really ended up being the Pope. Now, when did that happen? Most Protestant scholars would put it with Gregory the Great in AD 600, but it's really questionable. It could have happened earlier than that. It could be a little bit later than that. Gregory did not like to call, he was a humble man. He did not like to call himself Bishop of Bishops. He liked to call himself Servant of Servants. And he's known as Gregory the Great. If you read his writings, you'll find out, even though it was AD 600, even though the church had grown pretty corrupt at that time, he was really a pretty godly man, unlike some of the later popes. But anyway, that's how we know the history of the popes. That Council of Nicaea is really just one more proof that there was no pope before that time. Because even in AD 325, even though the Roman bishop's authority was extending, it really hadn't extended outside of Italy and the area around him. The Bishop of Antioch still had an area, the Bishop of Alexandria still had an area, and the Bishop of Rome was not over them. They were just set up as three patriarchs. So the second part of this teaching is going to be on apostolic succession. I feel like I hope this was interesting, but I feel like apostolic succession is even more interesting than this issue directly of the Pope. Apostolic succession was an argument used by the early church, and it is extremely interesting. And covering it is quite long, so I'm going to do that in a completely separate teaching. On YouTube, I'm going to have to break even this one up into small bits, but I'm going to do the apostolic succession one completely separate. I want to remind you of our websites. www.oldoldstory.org is mine. There's a lot of information there on the early church. And www.rosecreekvillage.com is the website of the village that I'm a part of, where we have almost 300 people who are together in community going after God. The scriptures say, "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity." We believe God has given us something that's a lot like what they had in the book of Acts. We have problems just like they did in the book of Acts, but it is a glorious thing for brothers to live together in unity, and I think you would enjoy that website as well. Thank you for listening.